Greetings class, Professor Seeger here. In this video, I will be going over a couple ways you can start breaking down a story into its basic components. I will also go over some terminology and aspects of a story that shape it on a formative level. Hence, the title of the lecture, Formal Elements of Fiction. I will also offer you some pointers to help you identify these formal elements and also discuss how they create nuanced meaning and detail in a story. At this point in the program, please remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and pad of paper to take notes during the presentation. If I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. Enjoy! Formal elements of fiction are those elements that characterize a story's form and the conventions it uses. They help orient the reader in the story. They are structural. These are not the only elements we can look at in terms of fiction. There are also tones, symbols, images, metaphors, and on, but those are other PowerPoints. We divide stories into elements to understand the story better. By looking at the elements individually, the reader can more easily examine how each one works in the story, as well as in relation to the other elements. Consider the car engine. There are many parts under the hood that make a car go. Each of them is important and much easier to understand separately. Once you get a handle on one element, then you can consider how it interacts and affects the other elements, formal or otherwise. Consider the graphic of the gears on the title page of this presentation. Each component is important. Lose one gear, and the whole thing falls apart. This helps you write better papers by helping you focus your points on one or two elements. This also gives you a specific thing to look for in a story. The biggest concern I have with literary papers is that students don't know what to focus on, so they opt for 4 pages of plot summary. This is not analysis and will result in a bad grade. By putting 1 or 2 elements under the microscope, we get a better understanding of what they do for the story and its themes. For example, when we reread a story paying special attention to the setting or a specific character, then we are going to notice more than if we didn't have that focus. If you want to understand how a car engine works, you have to start by examining the carburetor, or the transmission, or the engine block. This sort of analysis makes us better people by making us more critical thinkers. These elements and analytical skills will translate into the real world, not just in analyzing made-for-TV movies and cartoons, but all kinds of situations. Consider analyzing these stories as practice for analyzing and paying closer attention to the details in the real world we inhabit every day. Also, in another direction, reading these stories, poems, and plays gives us insight into the human condition and our various roles in various societies. We are exposed to new perspectives and lifestyles from different times and places. What we tend to find out is that people are people are people. Whatever the differences there are, more similarities connect us. Reading literature helps us realize that whatever we are feeling and going through, we are not alone. Plot is more than just a summary of a story. A plot is not only narrating incidents in a story, but more importantly, it is the form and sequence of those incidents and the causal relationships they have with each other. In other words, in a good story, complications or incidents or components each build on each other so that the first complication triggers, in some way, the second, and the second one triggers the third, and so on. Most stories begin with exposition, which is mostly background information to orient the reader into the world of the story and the situation of the major characters. Occasionally, a story will begin in the middle of a conflict and save exposition for a little later. That's called in medias res. Notice these choices the author makes, and consider why these choices were made, and assume they were intentional, and how these choices affect the experience and form of the story. There are two types of resolution. Most stories we are familiar with have some sort of climax, some sort of battle or scene that has a lot of action. The climax is basically the highest point of action in a story. It is the turning point. The climax usually causes the resolution. However, there are some stories, often when the conflict is man versus self, that have no discernible climax. Instead, a character may have an epiphany, which is a sudden realization or enlightenment of a character. The movies based on stories that end on an epiphany instead of a climax rarely do well in the box office. Without conflict in a story, things don't really go anywhere. The characters need something to overcome. When we talk about the conflict of the story, we are talking about the main conflict. Often there are minor conflicts along the way we call complications or rising action. I am told we can place the conflict of any story into 4 categories, or possibly a combination of one of these categories. How does this help us? By knowing the general conflict of a story, which might be made up of smaller conflicts or complications, we begin to understand the goals of the characters, the themes of the stories, and we also can better examine how the author chooses to present this conflict to the reader. By examining this, we have a better sense of how to take the resolution, and all of the other elements of the story, formal and stylistic. All stories have characters, and most stories have multiple characters that interact and have different purposes and roles in the story that will inevitably affect various other elements of the story. Here are some other roles characters can play. On the left are the different types of roles a character can play in the story. The protagonist, in the simplest sense, is the one the reader is intended to empathize or connect with the most. Almost always the protagonist is the main character, the one who has the most lines and whose perspective we get most completely. Sometimes, however, the protagonist isn't very heroic. The author sometimes creates protagonists who are big jerks, sometimes even people who are evil. Take, for example, the television show Dexter, where the protagonist is a serial killer. This man is not a role model. Think Pirate Lord Jack Sparrow, or more classically, Sherlock Holmes. Think about it. He was a pompous jerk. He was addicted to bad drugs. He snubbed authority in the form of Scotland Yard, and he's very famous for it. These characters are called anti-heroes. They are complex, and often the story is challenging the readers to identify with these characters. Antagonists, on the other hand, are usually representative of the major opponent to the protagonist. They help define the protagonist by challenging him or her in some way. They are typically the bad guy. However, that does not mean they are unlikable. Some of the most dastardly villains can be charming as heck. On the right are the way the characters are developed in the story. Round characters have many facets to their personality. Quite often, but not always, the protagonist is the most developed, therefore the roundest character. The more we understand the conflicting characteristics of a person, their motivation, their history, how they interact differently with different characters, the rounder they become. Round characters are more able to change throughout the story. Flat characters are often identified by one characteristic or trait. The reader only gets to see one side of them. In a way, they appear to be cardboard cutouts of characters. They can still be important characters in a story, but their motivation is usually easier to understand. Usually, flat characters do not change, or are incapable of change throughout the story. Stock characters are basically there to move the plot forward. They have one job to do, they do it, and that's it. Often, stock characters are only known by the job they do: the sheriff, the landlord, the old lady customers in A&P, etc. Final note: the concept of flat and round characters isn't an all-or-nothing deal. There are various shades of flat and roundness. When we consider the setting of a story, we not only consider the physical or environmental setting, whether the story takes place in a little mountain village, the big city, or a galaxy far, far away, but also how that environment affects the characters, themes, and all the other elements of fiction. Consider your typical American coming-of-age story set in a high school. Now consider the same story taking place in a school in the Middle East. It becomes a much different story. Setting can often be used symbolically as well. For example, anytime it rains in a story, you must consider whether that rain might represent a rebirth of the character, or a sort of symbolic baptism. Of course, this rain might not be a symbol at all if the setting for the story is a rainforest. Rain is a much more significant symbol in the desert, where it's rare. However, setting isn't just the physical environment, but also the social, historical, and cultural context of a story. Or in other words, the story's time and place in history. Quite often, the setting reflects and affects the protagonist in the way that environment positively and negatively affects the development of everyone to some degree. Therefore, it is usually important to understand the social and cultural context of the story. Typically, it is helpful to have a decent grasp of when things happen in a story, such as slavery ending, women's rights movements, etc. Consider the image above. This is either heartbreaking or adorable depending on the context of the image. Considering this is a military photo, the image is tragic. Why is it important to understand the point of view of the story? Glad you asked. By understanding the point of view, we not only know who the narrator of the story is, but also how they will reveal that story. This is more than just switching pronouns. We are talking the very nature of the story here. A first-person point-of-view story is very intimate. This is when the narrator is a character, often the protagonist, and we hear only one person's perspective. The whole story is filtered through this one personality. If you have family or friends who are good storytellers, you know that you are only getting one side of that story. Often, we get embarrassing details that we tend to identify with or be mortified by. Second-person point of view is hardly used in literary fiction stories, but it is used almost exclusively in RPGs and video games. You become the character in the story, and everything is happening to you. Third-person point of view is the most common. Where it becomes interesting and tricky is in its subcategories. It all depends on how much access the narrator has to the thoughts of characters. Omniscient narrators know all and see all. They are godlike in their ability to delve into the thoughts of characters, and no characters are immune. Narrators with limited omniscience only know the thoughts and feelings of one or two characters, while the rest are only known by their actions and words, which sometimes misleads us in stories as well as in life. With a third-person objective point of view, the reader only knows the characters by their descriptions, dialogue, and action. A third-person narrator may or may not be a character in the story, but a first-person narrator is always a part of the story, and therefore often less objective. Third-person narrators are almost always reliable. They may only know some of the story, especially if they are also a character in the story, but you can usually assume that they are telling the reader the truth, unless there are obvious signs to the contrary. The narrator is intrinsically connected to point of view, and is vitally important to the story, since this is the person telling it. As we all know, the same story can be told countless ways depending on the narrator. Just ask each of your parents how they met, and you'll see what I mean. In fact, we sometimes think that if a different character told a story, it would be a completely different story. When examining narrators, consider why the author chose this particular perspective, whether it is actually a character in the story or just a disembodied, all-knowing voice. Authors have their reasons. You must ask what they are. Unreliable narrators are narrators you out and out can't trust. They are either liars or delusional or insane. They have a secret agenda. Would you trust a story by the lady in the picture above? You might, but you might look for clues that make her unreliable. Unreliable narrators are almost always first person. But please remember, not all first-person narrators are unreliable. Each story will have certain attitudes and biases, but for the most part they are telling the truth. Sammy in A&P is not an unreliable narrator. Would other characters tell his story differently? Of course. But overall, Sammy is not lying to us. Consider this. You wouldn't call your grandfather, who tells a good story about being in the war, an unreliable narrator. But you might question the reliability of your drunk uncle who constantly talks about being abducted by aliens. Theme is often the most important element, as well as the most misused. The theme is not a simple lesson like don't drink and drive, or appreciate what you have. That is called a lesson, or a moral. It is a start, but it doesn't get at the complexity of what a theme is. A good story is going to have multiple themes, which are determined by the other elements of a story, or any text. Themes can be the result of recurring images, a character's actions, etc. Anything and everything works to create a system of themes and meaning in a text. So now you're asking, why is theme important and how do I use it in a paper? Good questions. Each good thesis statement argues or examines a theme in the text. We do this to narrow our focus. Consider which is a more interesting focus for a paper, one that A. examines how Sammy's characterizations of the older customers parallels his